Hey, folks. So I'm here with my friend, former congressional and U.S. Senate candidate Daniel Burke. And Daniel Burke has been traveling. He's been getting through this pandemic. So I thought it would be just a great time to check in with him once again. How is it going, Daniel? How did the campaign end up in New Jersey?
Um, it's gone very well, thank you. Um, I think that the campaign went very well because I told the truth, and for that I can be happy.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Started out as a Republican and you ended up being an independent, right? Is that how it worked out?
yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I learned from my campaign. I had begun with the assumption, which is why I had considered being a Republican, and I discussed this on your program. Um, I began with the assumption that the Democrats who chose to vote for Trump, who were thinking about how we need to end the endless wars, who were thinking about how free trade has been destructive to the United States, um, that those people were really interesting, and I wanted to talk to them. And I particularly wanted to talk to them in the midst of RussiaGate, which I think pretty much everyone can look back on that now and realize what an incredible scam that was, and how dangerous it actually was. But what happened, is that the Trumpers that I spoke to over this time were two things happened to them. One of them is that they were completely dominated by libertarianism, libertarian economics, um, which you've talked about a lot. And the other thing was that they got so maltreated by Trump, and failed by him, particularly with his going along with Mike Pompeo and the incredible anti-China witch hunt that developed. And so as a result, I have to say that I found that there's almost no one salvageable from the Trump, sort of general, what people called the Trump movement, but wasn't really the Trump movement. It was really people being, sort of preyed upon by these various other forces.
Yeah. Well, one thing I liked about your campaign was the push for, for peace and cooperation, standing up to the anti-China hysteria and the anti-Russia hysteria. And you went out and you did it. Even though it was a pandemic, you found a way to get to the people, right? I would see on social media pictures of you out handing out leaflets along the highway and stuff. Tell us about that.
Well, the best thing that I did in terms of, and like I said, it didn't work, but it was truthful. And we did I did what I thought was necessary, is we went to the only rally that Trump did in New Jersey,
Mhm.
and which was in Wildwood, New Jersey, in January of 2020. And so right before the pandemic really came to our shores. And we had a huge banner that said, Emergency Peace Summit, between Trump, Xi, and Putin, in which we were railing against the completely illegal and insane assassination of General Soleimani, and pointing out that this creates the context for a world war. And what I found was that many people were willing to discuss these things, but they had greater powers influencing them in terms of destroying their ability to have some kind of a revolutionary identity against financial oligarchy. And so that was quite disheartening, to be honest with you. Um, yeah.
Well, I mean, they go talk about the American Revolution, that there were the summer soldiers who would then flee when it got cold, but it was the winter soldiers, the people who took a tough stand, when it was hard. Those were the ones that were really committed. So to take that stand, to go out to the Trumpers and say peace now and stand up to that anti-China stuff, I think that's very admirable. So I'm glad you did that. Even if it was very frustrating to do. So thank you for your work, Daniel. We need more people sticking up for peace. And we wanted to talk today because the former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who I worked with, I know you had the opportunity to work with him, and I worked with him on anti-war stuff, around Syria and Libya and such. And I know you worked with him on different things. He described your organization, the Schiller Institute, as a factory of ideas. Right. And when I was overseas, when I was in Iran and when I was in Russia, people would ask me about the Schiller Institute, because of the reputation your organization has around the world. And one anecdote I was told by a German guy just blew my mind. He told me that back in the 1980s, he would see these posters on the walls around the cities in Germany. and in West Germany, and they would have a map of you know, like of Eurasia with like railway, high-speed railway going across it, and it would say things like "build the new Silk Road." And everyone thought that was crazy. Everyone thought that was some crazy science fiction or something. And now he looks back on that because it came true. It actually came true, and that shows how ahead of the times you all were. And so when Ramsey Clark called you all a factory of ideas, I think he was onto something. And so I understand now, in light of the pandemic, your organization is pushing for a world health system. Now, what exactly is a world health system?
The the conception is that we would take a physical economic view of public health in the world, by which I mean we would look at things like the Hill-Burton standard of the FDR period, in which the conception was we need a certain number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. It was determined to be 4.5 at that point. And so we didn't say, well, it depends on what the market says. We didn't say, oh, it depends upon, you know, how you can be profitable. We said, no, human life is sacred and we will guard it and defend it because that's the promotion of the general welfare. That's our intention as a United States. That's our constitutional purpose. And that means that we need to look at across the world the health systems that are so absolutely terrible. I mean, they barely even exist in many nations. You look at the number of doctors per 100,000 people in Sierra Leone, and you will be shocked. In all of Peru, there are only 4,500 ICU beds. At our recent conference, we had a member of the Schiller Institute in Peru speak, an economist, and he and his wife, who were in their late 60s, they got COVID. They couldn't get into any ICU bed. They had to set one up at home, and oxygen tanks, which they needed for his wife, cost $1,000 a bottle. So, and that's just one image. And all you have to do is take a look at the crematoria in India to really have some sense of this. Therefore, if we want to reverse this heinous disaster, which is created by the conditions of world economy over the past 40 years. In fact, Mr. LaRouche, he forecast in 1975 biological holocaust if the Club of Rome policies, if the oligarchical financial policies out of the City of London and Wall Street were continued. And so here we are today with that Holocaust. 9 million people died simply of famine last year. So we're working with, well, in fact, Mrs. LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, of course, Mr. LaRouche, he passed away, but Helga Zepp LaRouche, she is partnering with Dr. Joyce Elders, who's the former U.S. Surgeon General. She was Surgeon General under Bill Clinton. And they together, since June of 2020, have been putting together a committee of health professionals, military figures, all types of people, and bringing them together to formulate what would be required. For example, David Beasley, the head of the World Food Organization at the UN, he has said that he uses the phrase, food is medicine. Dr. Elder says, food is health. You're not going to stop this pandemic without actually doing things like doubling the world food supply. We're building really tens of thousands of new hospitals all across the world in the model of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, but in truth, to do that for every nation. That's what we're talking about.
Let me ask you about something you said, because you said 9 million people died from famine. Now, can you explain what that means? I mean, where these people died, how this happened? I mean, that's 9 million people is not a small number of deaths. I mean, that's Holocaust level numbers, right? That we're talking about here, right? So what happened? How did this happen?
Well, I mean, I think it's appropriate to immediately address what David Beasley is saying, which is that right now in Yemen, there's a famine of biblical proportions, and that if we simply provided $5 billion of food aid, then we could prevent those people from losing their lives to starvation. So I mean, think about the fact that last year we basically hypothecated $6 trillion at the Federal Reserve. We just came up with, we just turned on the spigot, it just flowed into the speculative bubble, but $5 billion to save 2 million people who are in danger of starvation in Yemen alone has not been gathered. So the critical thing, we could go through a lot of the specifics, but I want to focus on one primary issue, which is the moral indifference of the United States, of our own population. Of course, we know that our government is insane. You'd have to be rather dense not to recognize that. But what I notice, if you talk to a person and you ask them, do you think something bad is going to happen? Do you have a feeling like something bad is going to happen in the world or in our society? You can tell by their answer just what's going on in the country, because most people will respond, yes, I think something bad is going to happen. But it's happening. There is no going to. It's not coming. We are right now living under a type of a global fascist domination. And it's up to us to reverse that by reviving a belief in the sacred quality of human life and by pursuing policies that would actually defend and protect those lives.
We are constantly hit with a body count, right? Whenever you say you believe in communism, you believe in socialism, you think the Chinese Communist Party has something for us to learn from, immediately we're hit with, well, they killed people, right? And you're telling me that 9 million people just last year lost their lives because of the global economic system that we live under.
Yes.
So, and I also, many times I have brought up, what's going on south of the border, because during the 1980s, our government was funding these drug dealing terrorists, the Contras, that were in Nicaragua, and they were given weapons and guns while they smuggled cocaine and crack into the United States and brought about the crack epidemic. We were also arming these paramilitaries in Colombia that were fighting the communist guerrillas and were also heavily involved in cocaine and smuggling. And now, still to this day, there is a huge body count every year from the drug cartels in Central and South America. I mean, these groups that were armed by our government to fight communists in South and Central America are, they're killing people left and right. I mean, the body count is massive. 2009, Hillary Clinton and her State Department, with the approval or coordination, I guess, of the Obama administration, overthrew the government of Honduras. Now, Honduras, the drug cartels are rampant there, and it has the highest murder rate in the world. So it's like, you want to talk about a body count. I mean, my goodness. I mean, U.S. foreign policy in South and Central America. I mean, what do we think all these people on the border that are piling in, what are they fleeing from, right? So, I mean, the humanitarian cost of having a system where, the market is in control, profits just run rampant, is just quite massive. And I think people just miss that, right? We're told, we're given these body counts for this leader you don't like. Well, they killed this many million, but it's like every day they continued the wheels of the capitalist system just grinding onward, just have this huge death toll. And that number you gave, about 9 million people having died, that's massive. I mean, this requires massive action. We can't be indifferent about this. I mean, something must be done. And our own country is deindustrialized.
Yes.
That's the scariest part. So tell me more about your initiative for this World Health Organization.
Okay, so first of all, this is the whole point of the LaRouche policy of the New Silk Road going back more than 30 years ago, as you pointed out, which includes global infrastructure with the intention of lifting the living standards in every single country, and with the recognition that the way that you do that is through a respect for the principle of the sovereign right of every nation to economic development. And even further, what Pope Pius VI said, which is that development is the new name for peace. I think he said that in 1966 in his encyclical Populorum Progressio. And in other words, the reason that we submitted, or the reason that we find this kind of Holocaust happening, and including exactly as you described south of the border, is that there has been a failure to commit to the economic development of the third world, or
Yeah.
the so-called third world, right? The developing sectors, the places that it's actually wrong to call them former colonies because they are still colonized by the exact same powers of the British oligarchy and their associates in the American establishment. And that global financial control is fundamentally the cause of this genocide. I want to point out two things, and then maybe we can bring out another topic on this.
Sure.
The first thing I'd like to observe is that we have a commitment to Malthusianism, which is emanating from that source, named after Thomas Malthus. There's a commitment to the idea that we should reduce the world's population and that we should sincerely keep the poor impoverished. So I'd like to actually, instead of going into a second thing, please allow me to read a short quote, and then I'm sharing this because this is the context for the fight for world health development.
Your quote's from Malthus?
Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead. But before you do, I mean, let's let our audience know Malthus was a British economist. He was a British economist. I believe it was in 1798. He published his essay on the principle of population, which was where the term overpopulation comes from. From what I understand, it was in the aftermath of the French Revolution. In Britain, they were horrified. How could this revolution have happened? So he said, oh, the poor people just bred too quickly. The breeding of the poor people caused the French Revolution. Marx completely ripped him to shreds in his book Theories of Surplus Value and showed that he was completely full of malarkey, and that he was basically just a hired stooge, and he would get hired by the oligarchy in Britain. The rich people would pay him to write books to justify their policies, like driving up the cost of rent and such. So, yeah, I'd be curious. So what did Malthus have to say? Read me the quote from Malthus.
Oh, I will. Although I'm going to point out one detail in what you represented, which is that it was actually Benjamin Franklin who wrote a treatise on the importance of the increase of the population of humanity, that then provoked an Italian author to write an opposition argument, which then Malthus plagiarized as a representative of the British East India Company. So really, yeah, it's fascinating. That's actually from Lyndon LaRouche's book, There Are No Limits to Growth. But here's what Malthus had to say. Quote, this is from that exact essay which you referred to. All children are born beyond all children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread this too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. In other words, he's saying, encourage disease, poverty, and famine, and that's the way the world should be. And that is the overriding principle of the system in which we're living, in my view. And I think that can be very rigorously proven. And that's what we need to overturn.
Well, it's funny because as you read that, I immediately thought of this creep who's kind of a rival of our YouTube channel community here. I guess I'll have to say his actual name. I like to call him Skippy the Bear, but his real name is Thought Slime. And this Thought Slime character, I mean, his name is actually Slime, Thought Slime. He has recently been pushing the idea of degrowth. That's his new idea, that we need to degrow. And he insists that there's a difference between degrowth and austerity. But I've noticed that this this degrowth agenda also comes with kind of a celebration, like what you read from that Malthus quote about, things should be ugly, right? That things should be dirty. We should court a return of the plague, right? And it seems like that kind of outlook and degrowth, the idea that there are too many people in the world, we need to reduce the population, accompanies kind of a worship of death and a worship of destruction and ugliness in the world, in aesthetics. Would you say that those two things go together?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the chief proponent of the kind of ugliness in our culture, music, what's called entertainment, art really is what we should be dealing with, not entertainment. But they encourage ugliness in art in all of these areas of culture. I would say Theodore Adorno is really at the top of the list, as well as Lord Bertrand Russell. And what they represented at the Congress of Cultural Freedom, I forget the year of the first Congress, but the first time that they came together, but is a commitment to degrade the image of man, degrade people's idea of the dignity of a human being by using mass psychology in the form of popular music, where they try to convince everyone, everyone gets convinced it's popular, therefore it's good. But it makes you numb to the plight of your fellow man, and I think that is rampant in our society. In fact, when I was in Port Authority area recently, and I couldn't believe just how damaged the population is since last year. I haven't been in the city for about a year. When I was in the city, and my goodness, the level of grotesquerie that you find, the homelessness, the mental illness, and just the total ugliness and despair and barbarity. No, I don't care about other human beings. That's the message that you're constantly fed. So people should suspect that and begin to consider how you can take cultural warfare against that. What are the beautiful ideas that would give you strength to fight for the good?
Yeah. Wow. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I go to work. I've been going to work every day, and outside the subway stations, along the street, I see so many people that have, that are desperate, that are struggling, that have lost their jobs, and I see a lot of people that have also at the same time probably lost their minds. I remember one day I was out filming on the street, and this family walked up to me, and it was a mother and a father and their kid, and it was still a little cold. It was probably back in February. And I could tell that, they probably had been staying in a shelter or something. And they walked up to me, seeing that I was filming, and they walked up to me like, basically, anyone who could give us a job, anyone could, and they were trying not to look homeless. They didn't want to look homeless. They weren't begging, but it was apparent that they were probably staying in a shelter. And amid this pandemic, they'd lost everything. And I mean, at various points, the lines around the Catholic charities in Queens, were, huge
Absolutely.
lines of people. And this is, the USA, we boast about being the richest country in the world. And we've allowed this to happen. And now Biden's got this whole infrastructure plan, but it doesn't, it's like they can't agree about it. Even in the Democratic camp, they're not even clear what they want. And what's going on there? Do you think the Biden infrastructure plan is going to go through? What do you think's going on there?
Well, everything is in relation to China. Everything has to be seen in context of China. I think that there's just a remarkable situation happening in the left in the United States, and represented by many of people who are our discussion here, and people who are engaging with this kind of conversation, and various other networks that are simply regarding the fact that in China they take care of the population, and they have a concept of the mandate of heaven, which is to say the purpose of the government is to actually follow natural law and benefit the population, and that if you don't do that, then you're out. And that actually you will see the degradation of society. You'll see the collapse of society. And that's how you'll know that the mandate of heaven has fallen. And what's happened here in the United States is that we've gone into a total psychosis. Our economic policy, our cultural apparatus, everything is against natural law. It's all, in fact, false. It's actually not scientifically true. And so that's the main issue with Biden's infrastructure plan. Because the whole policy, I'd like to recommend another report to your viewers, which is this report we put out from the LaRouche organization, Attacking the Green New Deal, in which we actually talked quite a bit about Thomas Malthus and the modern day Malthusians, including the British monarchy, including Sir Michael Bloomberg, including Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, who are promoting the idea that if you use fossil fuels, that you are actually destroying Mother Nature and that this is unacceptable and we should stop it at all costs. The effect of this, South Africa had a plan, contract ready to go with a South Korean company to build 1,000-megawatt coal power plant, which meant that they could actually have more electricity for hospitals, which are very intense energy infrastructure. They use a lot of electricity. They could actually have the ability to care for their people with electricity. And instead, BlackRock, the largest private investment company in the world, came down from on high, from a supranational position, imperial position, and said, no way, you're not allowed to do that. The South Korean company, we're going to put you out of business if you dare to continue with this. The policy was canceled. The plant was canceled. There is no competent response to that. So when you look at the concept of greening the U.S. economy, or that we're going to be caring about climate change, you might notice you hear it from all of the worst people. You hear it from the military-industrial complex. The Army is very green right now. You hear it from the CIA and you hear from MI6. You hear it from all of the worst people because it is imperialism. And that's what's wrong with the infrastructure policy.
Wow. Well, we all know the CIA is like woke and anti-racist and stuff. Haven't you seen their new ad? They're the cutting edge of fighting for the rights of marginalized communities and all of that, right? That's the latest, right? So there you go. But we shouldn't really be surprised. I mean, the CIA has always been covertly trying to push a pseudo-left narrative. There's nothing particularly new about that. But it seems like we're up against a lot. We're up against Malthusianism. We're up against this, this economic view that, you talk about the mandate of heaven. I've always heard in the United States, we say the government is best that governs least, right? And that, keep the government's hands off, right? The economy takes care of itself. These are these things we're spoon-fed our whole lives, right? That the government has no obligation to care for the people, and it's best to just let the economy take its course, right? I mean, that's the American way, we're told.
I just think your continual emphasis on central planning of the U.S. economy, to me, this is a door to physical economics. From my standpoint, in the way that Lyndon LaRouche developed that science, because you start from the standpoint of the future and you work backwards. And that was how they electrified the Soviet Union. That's how we electrified the United States. That's how they electrified China. Because what we see now is that China has actually pursued a policy of using state credit to, first of all, defend themselves. They're defending themselves from international financial oligarchs, but they're using state credit to actually promote essential industries for their people and for the future. And they're committed, most importantly, in my view, to scientific and technological achievement. They're planning to have fusion energy by 2040. Now, that is what Alexander Hamilton speaks about in his report on the subject of manufacturers, in which he indicates that the source of value is the creative mind. That your resources, the idea that we have like limited resources is bogus, because every great resource of humanity, like this upcoming fusion power, comes from the mind. It comes from scientists working together and statesmen working to, pursue that.
Well, sure. And this notion of limited resources, I've argued with people about it. It's very controversial. A lot of people really just, adhere to that. But I've said to them, look, all over Africa right now, they are mining these minerals that you go back 20 or 30 years were completely worthless. They were rocks, that had no value. But the human mind, we developed computer technology and microchips and such, and now they're extremely valuable. I mean, the book, the Limits to Growth, that the
Yes.
club published in 1972, it argued that we were going to run out of oil by like the 90s. Well, we didn't. Why? Because the human mind invented new ways of extracting oil, right? And that this idea that we're always going to interact with our resources in the exact same way is delusional, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but if you went back to the caveman, what was he going to do with gasoline? Nothing. He would just be like, this smells weird, get it away from me. Back to the caveman, he needed coal. What's he going to do with it? He's going to look at his rock. He's not going to do anything with it. Didn't have any value back then because we hadn't advanced to the point that we used resources in a different way. And that the whole history of human civilization is that we're changing, evolving, and adapting the way we use our resources. So this idea, we're just going to keep using resources the exact same way until the end of time, and obviously they'll run out, and then we're going to be screwed. I mean, it's like not understanding the way humans operate. It's a very primitive way of thinking about things. It sounds very convincing on the surface of it, but if you just think for a moment, you'll realize, oh yeah, there's a bit of a problem there. Look, fusion energy. I think we need fusion energy. That is absolutely something that's needed. And keeping the world on fossil fuels is something that the big oil companies and big monopolies would like to do. They like to keep the world on fossil fuels and then tell the world, oh, because of climate change, everyone just has to reduce their consumption. We happen to have the monopoly on fossil fuels, so we'll stay on fossil fuels, and you have to keep buying it. And that'll be really convenient, and the world can just kind of get poorer and poorer and poorer as technology eliminates jobs at the assembly line, right? We need fewer and fewer of you to manufacture stuff, and we'll just keep driving the population down, reducing consumption, we'll degrow, and that'll be fine. The world will just keep getting poorer so that we can stay at the top and stay rich. But I think there's a lot of people who don't see it that way, and not all of them are leftists and workers and communists. I think there's a lot of small business owners who see it that way. My friend who's an airport bartender tells me that he would frequently meet small business owners, Republican, conservative guys from the South who were on their way back from China. And they said, wow, China is like what America used to be in the 1960s,
Yes.
the dream. And then a lot of these, a lot of small business owners, a lot of teachers, a lot of intellectuals, scientists, they look at what's going on in Eurasia with Russia and China with the boom over there, and they say this is the hope. And that seems to be the case. I mean, when I was at the Valdi discussion club in Russia, I heard Asil Toji, the head of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. He said that this is a golden era in Eurasia. I mean, in terms of construction and raising people out of poverty and electrification. So it seems like the energy is in the East, right? The hope seems to, at this point, to be in the East. The West is kind of in a bad situation.
I would totally agree. I mean, we've gone into a moral collapse that demands a new paradigm, because if you take a look at what Lavrov has said, the foreign minister of Russia, in criticizing the moral condition of the West, he's very explicit. Look at what they did with Syria. Syria is under the most heinous sanctions that you could possibly believe, and we're just viciously murdering the people. At least our government is, and associated governments. And Lavrov and the Russians, realizing this is a crime against God, it's a crime against humanity, came in and broke the sanctions and delivered food. And that's the type of thing that is going to happen increasingly. Recently, there's been a very surprising development of cooperation between El Salvador and Honduras on vaccines. A poor nation and another poor nation sharing the necessaries for life. And that is the kind of image, that we need, which sort of should inspire us, because my view is that we have an opportunity to win because China actually acts out of love.
Well, I got to bring this up because, China's vaccine is not patented. There is no intellectual property on it. So if you have the components, the ability to manufacture it, you can manufacture it, and you don't have to pay any copyrights to any company. Meanwhile, the United States, not only is there intellectual protections on the vaccines, but on top of that, we now find out that it was the policy of the U.S. government to lobby the government of Brazil not to approve the Russian vaccine, not for any public health reason, simply because they didn't want Russia and China to expand influence around the world. and that the policy of the U.S. government was to put pressure on countries around the world not to adopt the Russian vaccine because they thought that would expand Russian influence around the world. And how many people died as a result of that, right? You're preventing people from getting vaccinated because you're worried that the vaccine that they get, as a result of getting it, they might be more sympathetic to Russia or China. So it's better they don't get vaccinated at all. I mean, how is that not a crime against humanity? I mean, there should be burning outrage about this, and there is around the world.
Yes, I agree, and it's up to it's up to people who are like-minded in this regard to change the moral conditions in the United States. To reject this. I mean, I think the work that you guys are doing with BreadTube and with this Thought Slime Guide to expose what are these people actually telling the young people to do. I mean, that's creating fascism in the United States. That's my view, that people who are inculcated into this degrowth, pessimism, become a kind of a fascist mob.
Well, I think, there's some interesting history there too, because, Marxism as an ideology is optimistic, right? It views human history as marching forward like a train. First we had hunter-gatherers, then we have feudalism, and now capitalism, and eventually socialism, and the ultimate goal of communism. And it's fundamentally an optimistic ideology. And it was an individual by the name of George Sorel who originated the pessimistic interpretation of Marxism. George Sorel. And George Sorel, he disapproved of the idea that the Marxists should orient themselves toward the broad working class, the producers of the nation. And instead, he argued that you should build kind of a gang or an isolated group of violent individuals, that would be heroic because they engaged in violence, and that could be used to overturn capitalism. And he furthermore, he argued basically that that this gang he was creating through engaging in acts of violence, that they should have a pessimistic outlook. That the ideology of the cities, right, he said, was dangerous, but it was the ideology of the rural mystical tribes that was the hope and should be the basis of left-wing politics. And George Sorel was a Marxist. He was from the syndicalist tradition. But interestingly enough, he was a mentor to Benito Mussolini, and he was kind of an inspirer of Franco, the dictator of Spain, and his concept of national syndicalism, which eventually became Franco's dictatorship in Spain. You also had Mussolini, and kind of the basis for fascism is this: when you start taking the optimism out of Marxism, and it instead becomes a celebration of violence. You stop trying to organize the producing people of the nation, and instead start building a gang among the lumpen proletariat to kick the rest of society around. This is kind of the basis for pessimism, and I see a lot of that coming from BreadTube. I've been writing about that. There's going to be a book out soon, but BreadTube, I see a lot of that. I see kind of contempt for the people who actually go out and do the work of the country and create the wealth of the world. I see a romanticization of violence and destruction. I see a pessimistic worldview. I see this term they're now using, degrowth, which is just, I mean, how can you not be terrified when you hear those words? I mean, this is what leftist politics has become dominated by, and it's the opposite of what the Chinese Communist Party believes in, right? I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is from a completely opposite worldview. I think that the Gang of Four, before the rise of Xiaoping, they had some worldviews that you could argue were pessimistic.
Yes.
And the way the Red Guards were going around terrorizing people and such. But China is now, they're all about optimism. They're all about growth, wouldn't you say?
I totally agree. Here's my hypothesis, which I gained from studying the work of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. I think that the critical issue in China is Confucianism. In that, communism is a relatively recent development in China. It's a 5,000-year civilization. And it's my view that the fundamental respect for natural law, which is essential to Confucianism, the concept that we use in the West as natural law is known in China, or there's a similar corresponding concept, which is li. And it means that you can investigate the laws of the universe, which are unseen to man's eyes and senses, and you can then, by that means, understand the future course of the actions that you take today. And that ability has been destroyed in the United States. In my I think that if you want to be a revolutionary, you should study Plato, Socrates, you should study Nicholas of Cusa, you should study the great minds of the Italian Renaissance and the founders, the real founders of the preamble of the United States Constitution, the preamble, which is Hamilton, it's Franklin, it's that network. Because those people understood this concept and they pursued their political action as Republicans with a small r, as opposed to oligarchs. That to me is the difference.
One thing I want to give you all credit for, is because, if you read old Marxist books in the history of the United States, right, you go back to the Communist Party, the 30s, even up into the 50s and 60s, they always portrayed Hamilton as the bad guy, right? They talked about a Hamiltonian counter-revolution. Jefferson was the radical Democrat, we were told, even though he was, raping his slaves and had these, ridiculous libertarian economic ideas about the yeoman and such. But Jefferson was the good guy, according to Marxists. Hamilton was the bad guy. But you guys have been pushing Hamilton for decades. You guys have been saying that that's wrong. And now I've noticed that even among like some of these outlets that are kind of mainstream voices on the left, Hamilton is now suddenly popular. Christian Parenti, the son of the Marxist Michael Parenti, he wrote a book, Radical Hamilton, giving a wing interpretation that Alexander Hamilton was the good guy. There's a Broadway musical all about how great Alexander Hamilton is. And I think that goes to show that even if you meet opposition, if you just keep hammering away at a point and you just don't let it go, eventually you can break through, and that the way people think about things can change. Because, back in the day, I know older folks that remember, they used to have a bookstore, the Communist Party did, and it was called the Jefferson Bookstore, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, can you imagine that? A left-wing organization having the Jefferson Bookstore. I mean, it's just outrageous, but that was the narrative. Hamilton bad, Jefferson good. Now it's flipped. And it should have been common sense, because Hamilton, he was against slavery.
Yes.
Hamilton believed that the government had an obligation to control and regulate the economy. And on top of that, Hamilton wanted to confer recognition on the Haitian people when they rose up and broke their chains of colonialism and slavery. He was in favor of advocating and having diplomatic relations with them. The other founding fathers weren't going to have that. So that's really good, and I'm glad that you've done that. It's kind of like your new Silk Road posters that you were promoting back then. Sometimes it might look crazy at a moment, but give it time, and things change. And that's kind of what you said before about thinking to the future rather than thinking about the present moment, right? Thinking to the future and working back.
Yeah. I mean, that's just to return to the idea of the World Health System. If you really want to be human, you should look at the next 100 years and think about what you want the world to look like, and try to make it really beautiful. Which is why, like, your aesthetical sense, the ability to conceive of something truly beautiful is totally essential to be a revolutionary. And Schiller talks about this, Friedrich Schiller, the German poet, because the problem today that I see is people. I mean, it's not that they don't know that terrible things are going on. It's that they don't care. And that is the worst possible position that we could be in as a nation. It's the reason our government is insane is because our people are insane and immoral. And we have to do something about that. I'm not moralizing. I'm not saying you're going to go out and preach to people and give them religion. But I do think that Hamilton stood as the founder of the Manumission Society, the first Manumission Society in the United States, one of the founders. He stood on principle that man is in the living image of God. And today, I believe that people who are concerned about the state of the world, who want progress, who refuse to be pessimists, should be concerned about the 9 million people who died of famine, the 2 million people who are in danger of dying now. And it's actually way worse than that. Read David Beasley. He says that the judgment of his organization is that it is possible that over 250 million people are marching towards starvation right now, that there are not the resources to address the food insecurity, and that we're looking at a famine of biblical proportions. Those are his words. So if we want to address that, don't accept any of the liberalism, the insane liberalism of free trade, the insane stupidity that says, well, everything is subjective. You can't tell, you can't judge one is better than the other. Electricity and roads and bridges and high-speed rail and and hospitals. Those are the good, and we can fight for those things. And that's what I think is like worth standing for right now.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap this up by asking you one last question, because yesterday I did an interview with a guy named Jackson Hinkle. And you can watch that. It's on the YouTube channel. It's like the previous video. I'll post this later tonight. This guy Jackson Hinkle, he kind of took me by surprise, because instead of asking me a political question to begin with, he asked me how I became political. How did I become a socialist and all of that? So I thought we would end this interview by, Daniel, since you are somebody who's come on here, I think you've been on this channel 2 or 3 times at this point by now, and tell us, how did you become a political activist? How did you become a guy who's run for Congress and is I think I've seen you getting dragged out of places protesting, and it's like
Yeah.
So how did you go from being just another Joe to being Daniel, the political activist? Give us your story.
Okay, I'm going to match your humility in that interview, because I thought you were absolutely right. I mean, the point of talking about this kind of thing is to acknowledge that every one of us is kind of growing up in the midst of a collapsing system, and we each are trying to figure out how to find the strength to do something about it, and not simply to get, depressed and curl up in a ball and cry, And that was what I was doing. I went to Harvard. And I thought I was going to go and find a place of learning, and I found that I was being indoctrinated to be, a technocrat, a fascist technocrat, and and worse. And I didn't exactly understand it in those terms, but I knew that when I arrived there, that people didn't give a damn about the truth and were just looking for personal advantage, and that made me horrified and depressed. Then I decided to become a school teacher, because I thought that was something that would be like respectable. And I read a book in the Harvard Kennedy Library that said that the charter school movement is the civil rights movement of the day.
Wow.
Which is pretty ridiculous, right? Looking back on it, like audacious beyond belief. So I believed it, and I became a school teacher in New Orleans at a charter school. And I'm so glad that I did that, because I saw the incredible poverty in our nation. And I saw just how dysfunctional and destructive our system is, our present system is, our present policies are, not our real system, not our founding principles. And that radicalized me. And I started to try to figure out what was going on, and at that point, I realized I had been duped. And I had also found that I had been duped on environmentalism. Because everyone wants clean air and clean water and no pollution. Of course we do. But the idea that you're going to have degrowth to create that is insane. If you have degrowth, you're going to increase pollution. You're going to break down society. If we want to have progress, then we can solve those problems. And when I came to make those breakthroughs, then I felt I could do something about it. And I still didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be political. It's too difficult. But then I found myself compelled to. So I'm sure there are many other people who feel the same way, and I hope that our discussion helps them figure some of it out.
Well, audience, I present to you probably the only good thing that came out of Obama's Teach for America program, right? Daniel Burke, the anti-war progressive activist from New York and New Jersey. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your time, and I wish you the best, best to your wife and to your children, and all my best wishes. It's really a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure we'll have you back again soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Caleb.
Yep.